All right, so starting off with objection 5 for this part 2. So objection 5 reads as follows. It would make sense to say that a molecular movement in the brain that is swift or slow, straight or circular, but it makes no sense to say this of the experience of seeing something yellow. The objection being put forward here is that the idea that it makes no sense to talk about sensations in materialist terms, so say swift, slow, straight, circular, but they fit when talking about brain processes. So if they can't be described in the same way, how could they be the same? That's where they're trying to trip up this argument. So if there's have opposing properties or ways of talking about them, elements to them, how can they be identical? So after images are not described using materialist terms, brain processes are described using materialist terms. Therefore, after images and sensations and consciousness more generally are not identical to brain processes. That's what the objection is trying to say. Smart puts forward this reply in response. So far, we have not given sense to talk of experiences as swift or slow, straight or circular, but I'm not claiming that experience and brain processes mean the same or even that they have the same logic. Somebody and the doctor do not have the same logic, but this does not lead us to suppose that talking about somebody telephoning is talking about somebody over and above, say, the doctor. The ordinary man, when he reports an experience, is reporting that something is going on, but he leaves it open as to what sort of things are going on, whether it is a material solid medium or perhaps in some sort of gaseous medium or even perhaps in some sort of non-spatial medium, if this makes sense. All that I am saying is that experience and brain process may in fact refer to the same thing, and if we so easily adopt this a convention, which is not to say in our present rules for the use of experience words, but in addition to them, whereby it would make sense to talk on experience in terms appropriate to physical processes. So what he's trying to say here in kind of a roundabout way is that our terms for sensation and brain processes may not mean the same thing or have the same logic, and yet they still may refer to the same thing. So if you see this section here, using the example of like somebody and the doctor, he's saying that a statement about somebody is logically different to and does not have to have the same meaning as a statement about the doctor. But if we were to say that somebody is on the telephone, that doesn't mean that we are talking about someone over and above or distinct from the doctor. So we can still be talking about the doctor even if we use the language of somebody's on the phone versus saying the doctor is on the phone. So the point he's trying to make is that if we so desire, we could also adapt our language conventions, and that's kind of where he goes in this next little section at the bottom of this page. So if we were to easily adopt a convention, if we were to change, we can adapt our language conventions, so to speak, about sensations in terms appropriate to physical things. The fact that our semantic patterns are out of step with what we now understand about the nature of things in the world does not prove anything about the actual nature of things. It's subjective how we talk about different concepts, or how we talk about sensations is purely based on our language conventions. It's not based on a difference in what they are. So it's just our semantics, our language use, and that use can easily be changed. If we did want them to be talked about, if we did want sensations to be talked about in physical terms or physical terminology, we could do that if we adapted our language usage, which we have every possibility and ability to do. We just don't, because it's not necessary, it doesn't need to be done. Thus, right now we talk about sensations in the way that we currently do, non-material terms or non-materialist terms, and then we talk about brain processes in materialist terms because it makes the most sense for us and for our language patterns. That's what his reply really is trying to get at. So take that one away again. Objection 6. Objection 6 reads as follows. Sensations are private, brain processes are public. If I sincerely say I see a yellowish orange after image and I am not making a verbal mistake, then I cannot be wrong. But I can be wrong about a brain process. The scientist looking into my brain might be having an illusion. Moreover, it makes sense to say that 2 or more people are observing the brain process, but not that 2 or more people are reporting the same inner experience. So what this objection is putting forward is the idea that because sensations are private and brain processes are public, we can't talk about them in the same way. So public is an objective idea and private means it's more subjective. So because one is objective and one is subjective, he says that sensations and brain processes cannot be the same thing. So sensations are private while brain processes are public. One cannot be mistaken about sensations, but one can be mistaken about brain processes. So our subjectivity means that it can be incorrect. The objectivity of brain processes mean that there cannot be mistakes. And then that final part that he brings in right at the bottom. So 2 or more people are reporting the same experience. So it also follows that we can observe a brain process of more than 1 people can observe the same brain process, but we cannot objectively observe a sensation that someone is having. So our inner experience. So these are elements which can argue against them being the same thing. Thankfully, this one is a pretty short reply that gets straight to the point. It reads as follows. This shows that the language of introspective reports has a different logic from the language of material processes. It is obvious that until the brain process theory is much improved and widely accepted, there will be no criteria for saying Smith has an experience of such and such sort, except Smith's introspective reports. So we have adopted a rule of language that normally what Smith says goes. This reply pretty much comes back to language again. So this is a big issue for Smart's argument, and what he thinks will be things being brought up is how language comes down to it. So he believes that the language we use to talk about our inner subjective sensations and experiences is simply different to the language we use to talk about material processes in the brain. So once we account for these differences, the objection largely evaporates. He thinks that as of right now, we don't have the scientific technology to give a better account of one's own introspective reports, so our subjective experience, other than what that person is saying. So that last part here of, so what we adopted a rule of language that normally what Smith says goes, this is referring to the idea that pretty much what we know about people's subjective or introspective experience comes from what they tell us about it. Some point in the future, we may be able to have a more advanced like neuroscience technique that could give us a more accurate account or something more accurate than a person's introspective report on what they're experiencing. But as of right now, the best we can do is someone giving us their explanation of what's going on. So what Smith says goes is because Smith is giving us the content and explanation of what he is experiencing, and because we have no other way of finding out that information, we have to say that what he's saying is correct and true and take it for what he says. All right, on to 8. All right, on to 7. So objective 7, the objection itself is very short and reads as follows. I can imagine myself turned to stone and yet having images, aches, pains, and so on. So what this is trying to talk about. So I can imagine myself turning to stone and yet having images, aches, pain, so on. What he's saying is that I can imagine myself having sensations, but not having brain processes. So if you're turned to stone, you're not having brain processes, you're not moving or doing anything, your brain isn't firing, neurons aren't doing anything. But he thinks that, the objection is putting forward that it is still conceivable that sensations can inhabit bodies other than brain states or processes. So even if we do not have brain states, he thinks it's conceivable to still have the sensations, the mental states, consciousness more generally. So because it's conceivable, he thinks that, or he's putting forward that, sensations are not brain processes because we can imagine having sensations without brain processes. The reply is pretty long. This is one that we started talking about a little bit when we were talking about how we felt about smart, but it reads as follows. So the reply: I can imagine that the electrical theory of lightning is false, that lightning is some sort of purely optical phenomenon. I can imagine that lightning is not an electrical discharge. I can imagine that the evening star is not the morning star, but it is. All of the objection shows is that experience and brain process do not have the same meaning. It does not show that the experience is not in fact a brain process. This objection is perhaps much the same as one which can be summed up by the slogan, what can be composed of nothing cannot be composed of anything. The argument goes as follows. On the brain process thesis, the identity between the brain process and the experience is a contingent one. So it is logically possible that there should be no brain process and no process of any other sort either. So no heart process, no kidney process, no liver process. There will be the experience, but no corresponding physiological process with which we might be able to identify it empirically. I suspect that the objector is thinking of the experience as a ghostly entity. So it is composed of something, not of nothing, after all. On his view, it is composed of ghost stuff, and on mine it is composed of brain stuff. Perhaps the counter-reply will be that the experience is simple and uncompounded, and so it is not composed of anything at all, after all. This seems to be a quibble, for if it were taken seriously, the remark, what can be composed of nothing cannot be composed of anything, would be recast as an a priori argument against Democritus and atomism, and for Descartes and infinite divisibility. And it seems odd that a question of this sort could be settled a priori. We must, therefore, construe the word composed in a very weak sense, which would allow us to say that even an indivisible atom is composed of something, namely itself. The dualist cannot really say that an experience can be composed of nothing, for he holds that experiences are something over and above material processes. That is, that they are a sort of ghost stuff, or perhaps ripples in an underlying ghost stuff. I say that the dualist hypothesis is a perfectly intelligible one, but I say that experiences are not to be identified with ghost stuff, but with brain stuff. This is another hypothesis, and in my view, a very plausible one. The present argument cannot knock it down a priori. So this can be broken down into a few parts. The first part being this element at the top. So the very start. What is coming up here is that he's highlighting that we can conceive of a lot of things, but just because we can conceive of something being the case doesn't necessarily tell us anything about what it is actually like. So if you remember back, this links to the conceivability argument for Descartes. We said that was a weakness then, that it is conceivable. It doesn't necessarily tell us everything or tell us like fact truth. So like we said then, we are saying again now. So because we can conceive of something doesn't necessarily mean that it is true. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything about what it is actually like. So all that is being shown is that there are different linguistic meanings, but this in itself does not show that they are not in fact identical. All right. The second part of it is this argument of composed of nothing cannot be composed of anything. So what he's talking about is how it could be possible that there is no brain process or anything, but experience is still occurring. The only way that this is possible would be so where I'm talking about in the text is about here. So the dualist cannot really say that the experience can be composed of nothing, for he holds that experiences are something over and above material processes, that is, that they are some sort of ghost stuff. So because he's saying that sensations are not brain states, it must mean that they are some immaterial mental element. They are something non-physical. So for it to be occurring when we are set in stone, when we are completely solid, it must be something other than the physical. So smart is simply recasting it to say, well, this isn't correct. It's not something non-physical. It is linked to brain stuff. And that's him where he's saying here. So I say that the dualist hypothesis is intelligible, but that experiences are not identified with ghost stuff. So they aren't this immaterial nothingness. It is brain stuff, and it is a solid physical argument of how they are explainable, and that's what he's trying to bring up. So he thinks that we can't specify that sensations are something over and above material processes, and thus again we cannot show that they are in fact not identical. All right. This is the end of objections. It starts going into the conclusion after this point. So hopefully this helped a little bit for you guys.